actually were able to get water, but I don't know where the water came from, I don't know what they did, and I don't know whether it's something that lasts. But,
I don't think it lasted, but
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
because it's, I mean, that would be a little more cheerful.
Well, I did see a film as well that on the Mexican side of the border, if you looked at the vegetation in a lot of those shots, it was exotic species like tamarisk, and that they've been working at basically recreating native vegetation in wetlands, and when that chunk of water came down, they actually did capture that and recreate some pretty viable wetlands. So there is hope. But I guess for me, the last bit was about, well, we still can, right? Well, what that immediately said to me was, the only way we can do that is if somebody gives up water upstream. And that's the essential conundrum of managing water. And it comes right back down to here. It's the same thing. Is say we have a drought management plan. The only way we can have a drought management plan is if somebody gives up water. And that is not in our custom and culture. So that is, as we move forward and water scarcity becomes more and more of an issue, it's an issue as a society we're going to have to address. And it's going to be a difficult one to address. They're addressing it in the Jordan River, they're addressing it in the Tigris-Euphrates, they're addressing it in the Indus. They all have different solutions and non-solutions. But worldwide, this is a real problem. Let's watch the next one, which is about western Colorado, basically. And Vic, you'll like this because there's a lot of irrigation in it. And I say that truly because they're talking about the problems that ranchers and farmers are running into in this water shortage and how they're trying to do the right thing, but they still have to make a living. So I think, to me, I think that's another point of view we need to see.
The Colorado River Basin boasts the highest peaks in the lower continental units, the widest plateaus, the deepest canyons, and the lowest deserts in North America. In the desert Southwest, the climate is dry and the landscape often arid. Water management, however, through intricate irrigation and complex allocation, has made the desert bloom. Today, however, water is overallocated and shortages are expected to occur as competing needs drain more and more of the West's lifeblood. Water is the key ingredient for economic prosperity, for energy development and agriculture, for urban growth, the environment, and recreation. How that sparse resource, water, is managed in the future is an enormous challenge that will determine the social, cultural, and traditional makeup of the Southwest.
Now remember, we live next door to the ocean, but we also live on the edge of a desert. Los Angeles is a desert community, and without water, the dust will rise up and cover us as though we never existed. Now the Alto County Able can save us from this, and I respectfully suggest that $8.5 million is a fair price to pay to keep the desert from our streets and not on top of it.
You steal water from the valley, ruin the grazers, starve my livestock. Who's paying you to do that, Mr. Mulray? That's what I want to know.
The history of water has long been dramatic and tumultuous. Today in the desert Southwest, water shortages are pressing the limits on how we live, work, and play. In Colorado, a headwater state, we depend on the snow and rain that feed our rivers and fill our reservoirs. A complex system of laws allocates water among a growing number of needs, all of which depend upon the extensive Colorado River system.
The Colorado River belongs to 7 states. The 1922 Colorado River Compact allocated that water among an upper basin and a lower basin. Colorado was a part of the upper basin. In 1948, the upper basin states got together and Colorado got about half of the upper basin share. So we have about a quarter of the water supply.
Water administrators in the West are approaching a day of reckoning when population growth pushes the state's water supply to its limit. Juggling the use of water against future demands is no simple task.
It's a little bit like being in the middle of a rubber band, being stretched from both ends. We're being stretched by our water supplies to meet front range demands and our legal requirement to continue to allow water to go to our downstream states and Mexico.
Making matters worse are the uncertainties of climate change and worries over a prolonged western drought. Tree ring studies show that the climate has been in constant flux over the centuries, with evidence of more pronounced droughts in the basin than those encountered in the first part of the 21st century.
In an era of climate change and an era of intense competition with downstream states over the Colorado River's water, we have to be very, very careful how we use this remaining resource that we have.
The four major demands on water in Colorado are population, agriculture, recreational, and environmental needs and energy.
Colorado State, where 85 to 90% of the water historically has gone for agricultural use, but now we're starting to see shifts in that. And we have very intense competition going on today over the state's water resources. Part of that is fueled by 2.5 million new people that we expect by 2030. And beyond that, another 2 million people by 2050. If you have 80% of the population living on the front range and you see these very significant population increases, I think we're going to have a situation in the future where we have a sprawling city, basically, from north of Fort Collins to south of Knott. So that's one major factor in this pressure on Collins water. And then agriculture is the other sector that is so important in Colorado's future. Agriculture today is about a $16 billion industry. But agriculture is facing significant pressures over competition for water resources and a shifting of water resources from agriculture to cities and municipalities.
Many Colorado farms and ranches have managed water for over 100 years. Mel Reddick is a second-generation Western Slope farmer in the Grand Junction area.
Well, without water here in the valley, it's a desert, so we wouldn't have any plants grown at all other than desert plants. Water is just critical to our agricultural needs. Where it used to be just primarily agriculture would demand the use of the water, now there's 4 major demands, and some way we need to be able to figure out how to furnish enough water for population. It's just going to be a combination and a juggling act.
Colorado ranchers are land stewards who represent a rich cultural legacy. Carlisle Currier is a 3rd-generation West Slope rancher in the Grand Mesa area.
A lot of people think of agriculture only in terms of growing crops or only in terms of food. But agriculture, I think, is very important to the culture of Western Colorado. About 75% of the land in Western Colorado is public land, yet about 75% of the wildlife is on private land. And they're here because of the irrigated farmland, the irrigated cropland we have. If we dry up farmland, we're going to affect those issues of wildlife habitat, that open space that people in Western Colorado value. So I think it's very important, not just to us farmers, but to the people of Western Colorado as a whole, that we're able to maintain a viable irrigated agriculture in this part of the state.
Another pressure that's occurring in Colorado is over energy development. Colorado, particularly in Western Colorado, has extraordinary energy resources. These are resources which are nationally in demand, perhaps even internationally in demand. And so a lot of people are looking to Colorado, particularly Western Colorado, to provide those resources.
Today, oil and gas are highly visible on the Western Colorado landscape. Looming in the future is the potential for oil shale, projected as the highest water user in the energy sector.
Water administration in the future is going to change as a result of the increase in the oil and gas industry. And I think people would be very surprised if they went up on Peanuts Creek and saw how much land is no longer privately owned. It's owned by the bigger companies. And all of these companies either already have decreed augmentation plants and change of water rights, or they're in court right now doing just that.
We know that in terms of seniority, that the
After all, for the last 50
Yeah, that's part 2.
Of the same film.
That's what it says.
years, that's exactly what has happened all along the Colorado River. Without the massive dams, there would have been no cities in the desert, no industry, no agriculture. In fact, there came a point about 30 years ago when it began to look as if there was no room left on the river for any more dams. Yet, the region was still growing fast and needed even more electricity and more water. For the last 600 kilometers of its course, before it flows into the sea, there was really precious little
This is a
commerce.
different one, though.
Yeah, that's not the same thing for No, it's interesting enough, I like his accent.
Greg, do you know this?
There was.
I think he had to go.
He's got a new one?
Yeah, he's got a new
Yeah,
one.
why it's going to need to Bruce Basin.
He did not.
Actually fix it, didn't he?
I'll play around.
So we have about a quarter of the water supply.
Water administration.
Go to the search bar, yeah, I caught it.
Next to New Hampshire, the Grand Mesa area.
A lot of people think of agriculture only in terms of growing crops or only in terms of food. Agriculture, I think, is very important to the culture.
We have decreed augmentation plants and changed the water rights, or they're in court right now doing just that.
We know that in terms of seniority, that those are senior or could curtail some pretty significant existing uses of water. For the time being, they're continuing to use those for agricultural purposes on lands that they've been used historically. But we know ultimately they would think of converting those water rights to industrial uses.
If that occurs, it is going to place a burden on our river. It's going to change the way we operate the river, because that's another big use of water. Could become even a bigger use of water than municipal water is today in the West Slope. And if that occurs, certainly agriculture is once again going to be a target for the energy companies' need, and something that we certainly need to be aware of is down the road in the future.
The energy companies are paying good money for these senior agricultural rights. We don't think it's because they want to be in the ranching business.
People love to recreate on our lakes and our streams and our rivers. Hunting and fishing is a $10 billion industry in Colorado. And there's a lot of pressure on us as state leaders to protect the viability of the state's streams and rivers and lakes for what we call non-consumptive purposes.
Recent water allocations have included recreation, a growing part of the state's economy.
In 2001, the Colorado State Legislature recognized the value of recreation in the state of Colorado. They went and formulated legislation that would allow entities like the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District to file for a recreational in-channel diversion. A recreational in-channel diversion is a non-consumptive water right, meaning that it does not consume any water, but it does establish a place and time for demanding a certain amount of water for recreational use.
This means a lot. This improves our boating so much. For the beginner, intermediate, to improve your skills, it's safe, it's welcoming, there's no real challenges here and obstacles. So, it's improved the whole season.
The four major water needs, population growth, agriculture, energy development, as well as recreation and the environment, are under threat from increasing competition, climactic fluctuations, and the new challenges they bring.
There are major uncertainties as to how much water we have, how much water we can use in the future. The first uncertainty is what's going to happen downstream for our energy industry, primarily oil shale. We really don't know how much water water will require because the technology to develop oil shale hasn't been proven out yet. A second major uncertainty is what's going to happen to our climate. There's a belief and a strong scientific consensus that man is accelerating a change in climate. We're making this earth warmer. Does warmer mean less precipitation? No, not necessarily. We may end up in a situation where the mountains of Colorado get more snow. We really don't know. But we do know a warmer world means that people will use more water. Crops use more water. People in their homes and their lawns will use more water. So we have demand uncertainties on the Front Range. We have demand uncertainties in western Colorado for oil shale. We also know that climate is changing, and where it's going to go, we don't know.
Bill Trampy, a recognized and respected water leader, is a second-generation rancher in the Gunnison Valley. He brings with him a rare blend of traditional ranching and visionary clarity.
I'm sure that if we come into times of shortage, that there'll be a demand for water on the Front Range that is going to curtail uses on the West Slope, agricultural uses on the West Slope. That's going to be very hard on West Slope agriculture. And the kind of agriculture that we're looking at here today, it's probably going to ruin. I hope we're smart enough to know and figure out how to prevent that happening in the Colorado River.
Water in Colorado fluctuates with the climate and the seasons. It is a precious, finite resource besieged by a growing number of competing needs. As water is stretched thin, hard decisions must be made. Those decisions will determine the future of Colorado and the entire southwestern United States.
I want to put a couple of people on the spot here. And the first one, some of you may know that, Travis, you kind of cut your teeth in Colorado. Do you have any comments that you'd like to make after what we just saw here with your experience there?
On the spot, indeed. No, I mean, you see a lot of what, everything in scale is bigger there, and everything is than what we have going on in the valley, but the issues are similar, right? When you're looking at that use of that water, that open canal flood irrigation, that the valley, we've already moved into sprinklers, but there's another level to go beyond that into more efficient type of sprinkler systems. It just takes more money. But everything's on a progression towards allocation of use. But I think a lot of the issues that are presented here are indeed germane and to what we have going on here, and so these films are useful as we have this conversation and move forward in this conversation that we're having. So, yeah.
Well, and Vic, I know you're trying to get out of this, but I'd like to hear, you've had a lot of experience with cattlemen and even statewide. They talk a lot about pressure on ag, basically for ag water, for other purposes. How do you feel about that? Do you think that is actually occurring here in the state and locally?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It is. Those other uses have so much more money to throw at the situation, and it becomes attractive for agriculture to shoot that water that way. So, and there's varying degrees of value in agriculture. So somebody that, like up in this area, is growing alfalfa, and somebody wants to raise high-value fruit or grapes or something down by Tri-Cities, it becomes a real attractive dollars and cents thing.
So and thank you both for your comments. It's that's a good kind of moving on into what I was going to talk about right here locally, which is in-stream flows and how we set them. So if I can actually navigate this doggone thing, I'll see if I can get us there. Let's see. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, I didn't ask for any comments.
No, my comment is just, it's funny that it's documented that the pastor is not present. I'm just saying. It's very secure.
Let's try it. There we go. Now, let's see, we need to get that. I don't have my glasses on. Can you see the big screen thing on that?
Sure. You want it to go presentation mode?
Yeah, the slideshow.
Okay. This is a different format.
The slide shows up at the top.
Up at the top of
Oh,
the
okay.
slideshow right there. There, I can see it when I'm there. Just hit slideshow. There we go. Hold on, we're gonna get there. You're very lucky tonight. I only have 6 slides and hardly any pictures, which is probably not a good thing. I'll start by with this first slide. First, you can see I'm not an expert. Why am I even talking about in-stream flow management? I have some experience, mostly as a bystander when I worked for the U.S. Forest Service, and I was involved in the in-stream flow setting discussions for Wolf Creek and the Chewuk River, and then later when I worked for the Bureau of Reclamation for the Eniak River. And so that was when I was first introduced to how people worked towards setting in-stream flows. My role was not as a technician or a technocrat. My role was mostly representing the federal government there, and also I kind of fell into a mediation role in these discussions because we had no fisheries on one side of the table and the irrigators on the other side of the table, and it was they were not easy discussions. So what you're seeing here is mostly a lay person's perspective on what water management looks like in the real world, and this is what I think could possibly, if we decide to address in-stream flows here at some point in the future, either distant or not so distant, what it may look like. So that's the purpose of this slideshow, is to just get you thinking about what it would look like if we went that way. Now I figure out how to advance this in really good shape. Let's try that. What is in-stream flow management? The more people you ask, the more answers you get. This is what it usually means to most people. It's a regulatory framework, and that's important. It's a regulatory framework, and it's going to be imposed by the state, sometimes by local water districts. It can also be a cooperative framework among irrigators. That's a kind of a rare thing, but it is some sort of cooperative or non-cooperative regulatory framework. And I noticed I put water balance on there because what it means when you're regulating in-stream flow is you're regulating both the water in and the water out of a system. And your water in, like in the Methow, we don't have a lot of control over our water in. It comes in the form of precipitation for the most part, and there's a lot of it that comes in. Believe me, hundreds of millions of gallons per year. But in other areas, say the Yakima, where the system is highly regulated by reservoirs and dams, then all of a sudden your regulatory framework becomes much more complicated on your water in. And your water out's pretty obvious. It's all the withdrawals. It's wells, it's diversions for various purposes and so forth. But that's the important thing, is that when we talk about water management, it's a regulatory framework. Backwards. Let's try that. Usually what happens when you start talking about in-stream flows are a little bit of a code word. They're a code word for minimum flow. And where we end up on minimum flow is basically trying to get a group of people to agree what the aquatic ecosystem needs. And you notice I'm saying this is also, it's reach specific. Usually when you're talking about it, you don't talk about the whole stream, you talk about this particular chunk of the stream and its aquatic ecosystem. Now, what a lot of times is missing from that discussion from some points of view is, well, what about the human ecosystem that's dependent upon that water? And we saw that in those films. That's the tension that usually arises. But because the regulatory agencies are usually driving that discussion. The discussions usually come down to minimum flows in an aquatic ecosystem.
Only junior water rights can be withdrawn, right? I mean, senior water rights can still, even if the minimum flow isn't met.
Yes, yes. Well, I'll touch on that in a little bit, and you feel free to add when I make mistakes. The other thing to keep in mind is people talk about in-stream flows, and you immediately jump to, well, it just means how much water's in the river. But the other thing that always comes up in these discussions, and anyone with a fish background will tell you, the timing of the flows is absolutely critical as well. So when you're setting in-stream flows, you talk about not only the quantity of water in the river, but at what particular time is it most important to have that water there. For example, we know here that now salmonids are susceptible during the late fall and winter because of the way flows are distributed in our river, where the flows drop to a very low point at that time. And that has always come up in the discussions I've been part of. Why do we need in-stream flow management? Well, that answer is pretty easy. That's why. That's why. It's very true. That the reason you have to do it is what we just saw in the films in Colorado, is because there is an awful lot of competition for water. I put these down. You guys could probably figure out in the Methow if I missed something. But the competing water users are natural ecosystems. Now you say, well, wait a minute, how's the ecosystem using water? Well, of the water that falls in the Methow Basin every year, only 2% is used for human use. The rest of it is used by the ecosystem. It goes back up in evapotranspiration, or it flows out the river and feeds the aquatic ecosystem. We're only 2% of that whole equation in the water balance. So the ecosystem has a pretty big demand on it. Agriculture, water rights, municipalities, our towns use water, and I want people to live in the towns, and so they have to have water. We have in the Methow, we have group domestic systems, Edelweiss. There's a number of people that are on systems, and they all require water, up at Lost River Airport, for example. Then the one that's come into the spotlight recently, single-family domestic wells and stock water, which is the other use that's been allocated here. And then last but not least, recreation. They mentioned it in Colorado. It's not so important here. But remember, there is a developing, and if we are as good as we think we are about bringing fish back, that the angling is an important use of our rivers and our water. In other words, there's guided fish guides around here. There are people that are doing guided raft trips when the flows are high enough and that sort of thing. So that's another use. Did I leave something out? What else what's another possible competing use for the water we have here? Can you even think of one? Because I'd like to get it right.
Small hydropower systems.
Small hydro. Now that's a non-consumptive use.
Still needs water.
Right. Yeah. Still needs water.
Out of basin transfer.
Yeah. Out of basin. Did you guys hear that? Out of basin transfers. Right. That's been a big issue. Okay, I'll modify that slide in case I ever have to do this again.
That's the scariest thing, because like Blake said, I mean, there's a lot more money out of this valley if you're building a, Bitcoin factory and other kinds of stuff, and population growth and a tech, where everybody's making lots of money, they can spend it, so the question is how do you keep the water from being bought away?
And what an in-stream flow setting exercise does is it tries to balance between those water uses and come up with the least common denominator is usually what you end up with. Hopefully you end up with the greatest good for the greatest number. That's fairly optimistic. I've seen it happen once or twice in my lifetime, but usually not. Now, here's the thing. We already have in-stream flows set in the Methow Valley. And that's important to remember. So what we're talking about as we move forward here is that we're not talking about the first time ever that we've gone down this track. It would be, do we want to take another look at what we have. So here's what we have. And this kind of gets to your point. We have adjudicated basins. Now, generally in adjudications, at least in my experience, they don't set in-stream flows, but they do de facto. They do just because they tell people how much they can withdraw, that affects the in-stream flow. So that is, in a way, a regulatory framework that is going to affect the in-stream flows. Now, they were established in much wetter times back at the beginning of the century, and so the story I like to tell is one of the first Bureau of Reclamation projects that after Theodore Roosevelt created the Bureau was the Conconully Reservoir system over there for the Okanagan Irrigation District. And they did their original surveys and they chose to dam the Salmon River. Salmon River? It's called Salmon Creek today, and it's almost dry where it runs through Okanagan. But from 1888 to about 1916, it was the Salmon River. And they built those big reservoirs up there, and then the climate changed on them. And this is about the time these adjudications were being ruled upon. And the hydrographs they used, and I've seen the one for Beaver Creek in about 1914, and there was a lot more water coming out of those streams, and so they gave away a lot more water. So now what happens is we dried out, and they didn't fill those Conconully reservoirs until 1946, because they went through the dry 20s and 30s, and then it got wet again in the 40s, and now it's drying out again. So what happened was that the de facto withdrawal in-stream flow in a lot of these smaller streams was zero. It was zero. And the only person taking water was the Class 1 water right holder, because they had the ability, and still do, to take the entire credit. So is this wrong or right? It's the law. And that's the important thing, is that it is nothing that's going to change anytime soon unless Natalie has inside information. We also have the Methow Washington Annotated Code 173-548, and it has a very complicated system of in-stream flows built into it. Actually, almost a two-tiered system, and again, considering time, it has flows that are established per month, in fact, bi-monthly, and those set a floor for water use in the Methow, with the notable exception of what we call the reserve, the 2 CFS reserves, which they created to allow people to build homes and have a domestic well. But where did those flows come from? Well, they were set in the early 1970s, or the technical work was done in the early 1970s, and it was done using much more simplistic models than are in existence today. And basically, they just took a couple of cross-channel sections, and figured, okay, if the river comes down to about here, then we're going to call that where you're losing any aquatic ecosystem benefits at all from the water. But it was one of the first things that the Department of Ecology did. They had only been created a few years before, and what they did for the first time, moving beyond adjudications, was they considered environmental benefits. So when that rule was enacted, it was considered to be sufficiently protective of the aquatic environment in the main stems. Now, there was almost no gauging information for the tributaries. Twist River, Chewok, the main gauge was down at Patera, so they kind of built everything off of very little data. But so, whether or not those flows were sufficiently protective in the tributaries, it was a guess. It divided the Methow into 7 reaches along the main stem, defined by river mile and not by hydrologic continuity, and just said, okay, you get this much water in this much reach at this time of year. That's basically the regime we're operating under now. Do we want to revisit existing flow regulations? I put a question mark there. This is kind of what would happen, as I talked about in the beginning. This is kind of what it would look like. The coin of the realm is in-stream flow incremental methodology. There's a quote from a Washington State Department of Ecology person who wrote a paper on this. You can go online and you can read her paper. But it is still, especially in Washington State, regarded as the best available method. So where are we going to get the money to do this? We're going to probably get it from the Department of Ecology, and they are going to say that's the best available method. That's why we would be steered into that box. Other places in the world, and even other places in the United States where they have kind of a little bit different idea of water law and water regimes, riparian doctrine and so forth, they might use other methods. They're out there, but this is the one that we would be steered to. What's it look like? The first thing is it is a water management tool. It is a method. It is not an ecosystem model. And as I sat in those discussions, I heard that being confused all the time. Is that, oh, IFI, yeah, we're gonna model a river and we're gonna come up with a flow. No, what it is a process of discussion and interpreting data that's provided to the people in the process. The key component is that you get your stakeholders in a room and you present the data and they try and come out with a solution. If you go online, and this is not the Watershed Council talking, this is me, but if you go online and you start looking up IFIM, a lot of the articles were written by regulatory agency employees. And so this part, which was emphasized in the original, it was the original method was defined by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in about 1992, 93. This part is sometimes left out because the regulatory agencies believe, well, we have the technical expertise and we are supposed to be protecting the aquatic environment, so we're going to kind of drive this process a little bit. That interaction and communication is something that I think if we ever go into this process, we need to be very careful that we take our full part in that process. Because the assumption among many people, and I have been in the room with them, is that, oh, well, we kind of know what's best, and so we're going to let you know how it goes. Yes. Oh.
Who defines who a stakeholder is?
That is a good question. Usually the person who's buying the study. And so...
And who would that be?
In our case, it would be ecology. That's my guess, because this is expensive. But one thing that happened, and if you read online again with the Geller report, the goal of ecology, as stated in their documents, is that they wish to eventually apply the IFIM flow setting process to every stream in the state, to all the major streams. That's kind of like saying they want to have every basin adjudicated. It's going to happen someday, but I'm not going to be around when it does. But that is their stated goal, is that IFIM should be applied to develop in-stream flow management systems statewide.
They prioritize what streams they want to do this process on.
Well, again, I'm being a little bit cynical here, because I was a bureaucrat for many years. And we tend to run to the sound of the loudest explosion. That's usually the prioritization system, or where the money is. But I'm not aware, and I may be wrong on this one, I'm not aware that there is a list that says this is most important and this is most important. It tends to be where the lawsuits are.
And where the communities ask ecology to undertake the process. So ecology is very, and has said very recently over the last 2 years, I mean, they are open to this process here. They would like us locally to come up with a proposal that ecology can endorse. So they're hoping for strong stakeholders.
When you say us locally, who is that? Is that the county? Is it the watershed council?
You'd have to ask ecology. I can't answer that question. I can say my impression is it is the local communities, the county, most importantly also the tribes, Yavapai and Pole.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. The one place ecology will not go is where they're not wanted. And if the community expresses support for an exercise like this, that's why I'm confident that we could get it funded. Because they like to work in friendly environments.
And then they will provide the money if the community wants it.
If they have it, but it's not an endless well. And so to fund a study of this sort, if I had to throw out a number, you're talking well over $1 million. And they would have to put that in a budget request and go through the whole process. They don't have that kind of stuff laying around in the desk drawer.
And does their process include doing whatever modeling is needed to fit into the?
Yes.
It does.
Yes. And we'll get into that a little bit. This is the next thing on IFI, I'm getting back to that, is incrementally, and you'll see how they do this with their modeling, is the idea being that rather using extremes and arguing about them, all the water and none of the water, the idea is that you can create a system where you can stage the flows incrementally, and then everybody can sit back and look at it and say, oh, well, maybe that might work, for my interest, as opposed to, it's a matter of who gives up a little bit. Compromise. It's not a popular word these days, but compromise is what you have to be looking for. The outcome is whatever group you have are going to recommend the plans and policies that they feel that the regulatory agencies should apply to water management. So that's hopefully your eventual outcome. My experience has been water is such a contentious topic that many times groups can't reach agreement, and that's when the adults in the room step in, namely the agencies and or the courts, and they answer the question for you. But hopefully, I think we're better. I think our human capital in this valley is certainly capable of coming up with a rational and cogent discussion about how our water needs to be managed. Yeah, sorry, went the other way. Here's what I was, talking about here is the basis of this from the technical aspect is you're going to come up with a simulation model. The one that's popular with the biological community is this PHAB-SIM model, because what it does is I kind of drew it. You probably can't see it because it's dark in here, but what it does is it produces curves. It flows along this axis. And you have habitat in square meters on this axis. And so you take a life stage of anything living in the river, whether it be a salmonid or a lamprey, anything, and the biologist will put in, well, how much of what kind of habitat do these things need, say when they're rearing, or when they're juveniles, or when they're out migrating. And they develop these called, it's a flow habitat relationship curve. And so what they do is they'll develop these curves, and you have flows here. And so this would be the sweet spot for fish right there. Say this was salmon spawning. So this curve would be developed, and the biologists would look at this and they say, oh, well, at this flow, this is where the fish are going to do their best in the spawning environment. But what happens in this negotiation is somebody else that looks at that flow and says, well, wait a minute, I've got an irrigation diversion, and this isn't going to work for me. How about we cut the top of the curve off about right here? Let's move this back a little bit and so forth. And so incrementally, you can look at these PHAB-SIM curves, and you can kind of develop a compromise solution somewhere between here and here. That's the way the process works. I put EDT in there because that is, when I was involved in these discussions, PHAB-SIM information was a little basic. It only measures 4 components of the aquatic ecosystem. It measures velocity, depth, substrate, and what's the other one? Escapes me now. But EDT, the ecosystem diagnosis, yeah, right, thank you. Diagnosis improvement. Is a much more complex model. It uses a lot more habitat information to develop a picture of what habitat should look like. And so I believe that work is being done to feed the EDT information into the PHABSIM information to make it a more robust model. The other thing about this is PHABSIM models are built on transects across the river. There has been a PHABSIM series of transects done in the Methow. They were done by Catterfield and Caldwell in about the early 90s. But I think they were done mostly to try and do a little bit of ground truthing on the original flow setting that was done in the 70s. And there were only 4 of them for the whole basin. There was one on the Chewuk, one on the Twist, one on the Maidstone Methow, and one upstream of Winthrop. And those transects have been lost. They were not hard-pointed. We didn't have GPS in those days, so you had to survey them in, and they didn't put the money in. So we don't know where they are. When I worked for the Bureau, we had the data. We just couldn't go back to the transects to confirm it. So I had a consultant go over the data to confirm Catterfield and Caldwell's work, and of course he came up with a different conclusion, which is not surprising given the fact that the data is a little bit erratic and there weren't very many transects. But you can use other simulation models. You know, what's your weighted usable area in a recreational scenario? Well, kind of 0. You know, stuff like that. So you can feed all of this into that, not just PHABSIM curves, but that's why it's a discussion among stakeholders driven by data that's developed from various models. Your outputs of your PHABSIM things, you'll hear this as we talk about in-stream flow settings or weighted usable area. And basically, again, that's in square meters. And what it says is that if we increase the flows this much in this reach, how much area of wetted usable habitat are we going to get? That's what the model's going to tell you. If we drop it this much, how much are we going to lose? And then, so we're talking about a little bit more real things, we hope, than if we're just saying, oh, there's too much or too little, which a lot of the in-stream flow discussions are based on, too much, too little. I want to emphasize this point. Modeling, I misspelled modeling, is only a small part of the entire process. What it does is it informs the group of stakeholders in the ideal world of IFI. Should we embark on this journey? Here are my thoughts. My experience has been that much of our present water conflict is based on disagreement about how much water we have and how much we need. And until we get a good answer to that question, we're going to be arguing by assertion. I assert that the fish need more water. I assert that my farm needs more water. And until we get that answer, I don't see a lot of hope for resolving those conflicts, especially since the resolution is also troubled by a basic tension between water law and planning, because that's why we are where we are now. Is that in this state, water law and planning laws have not interfaced well. They've been mostly told to interface by the courts, and that's the worst possible solution, in my opinion. Somebody else brought this up. We just had our first brush with that little episode. Tri-Cities need a lot of water. Great growers need a lot of water. And they have more money than we could ever possibly put together here in the valley to hold the water here. And remember, water is a private property right. So who is going to, we restrict our private property rights all the time. There's no doubt about it. We have zoning and everything else. But it's a very sensitive issue, especially for politicians, to get into the idea that we're going to tell people they can't sell their water. Even if it is for the common good to keep it up there. So, my thought is, well, maybe we have to create our own water market up here somehow and find a way to capitalize it. But
would you say that again, Greg?
What's that?
Just what you just said.
could we create our own water market up here and capitalize it somehow so that if somebody wanted to sell their water, we could make it worth their while to keep it here? Pipe green? Probably, but at least let's think about it a little bit. I think it's important that we pay close attention to that, because once that water goes downstream, it's never coming back. So if we want to someday in the future, and my great-grandchildren, they figure out another way to grow things up here, they won't have the opportunity because they won't have the water.
I have a question about water, right? Sorry if I just came here
Oh, yeah.
late, but I was somewhere else. A part I haven't understood about the private property right part is that it seems like the private property right is to use the water, not to own the water.
That's true, the state owns the water. But it's,
So how does that work?
I think Natalie, or you might want to speak to that a little bit.
It's a special type of property right, which is, it's called a use or fractory right, which means it's, you only have the right to use it. You don't have the right to just keep it, except that there are certain provisions under our current state law by which you can, in effect, hold on to that water for a while until you decide what you do with it.
But again, it doesn't seem, what I'm hearing and what you're saying doesn't include selling it.
No, it includes selling. You just have to go through Department of Ecology for approval, but you have the right to sell your water.
But it seems like that's what
Yeah,
that
so what you
is.
have the
The
right,
language
you
says you
have,
can do that.
yeah, you have the right to sell the use of your water. So you
Is
can
that
sell.
something that could be changed? I mean, I know it's been
Absolutely.
a long time. Are there people working on that?
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit, or?
I think it's outside of the bounds of.
Oh, okay, so but just, it's something that can be done, there are people working on it. Thank you.
Another reason is our hydrograph is changing. A lot of you people have gone to the climate change talks. Does everybody know what a hydrograph is? It's kind of a graph of how much flows in the river at any particular time. And so what that means is that the timing and amounts of water that are coming down the Methow system are changing. How fast? That's up to the modelers to tell us. But at some point, do we need to ask the question, do our present flow regulations usefully match reality? And what time will that be? And who is going to tell us that we have to take that look? That's always in my mind is are we going to wait till somebody tells us we have to do it, or are we going to try and be proactive? But the dangers of being proactive is that we may not like the answer. So it's a balancing. It's a balancing act. I tend to have a scientific background, so I just want to go where the thread of data leads, but I don't make my living, trying to grow a crop. So that's a whole different story. I can see their point of view. It will be long, contentious, and expensive. But what's the alternative? That's the alternative. Agencies and courts. And we know how well that works because we've just been exposed to that for about the last 10, 15 years. And I don't think it's an efficient and effective system.
Do you have some description of what long is and what expensive is?
I would say expensive up here, and that would include, back to your question, the PHABSIM curves, the full meal deal. If I was setting up this project, I would say it would take me about a year and a half just to get the data collection going and up and on the ground, and a lot of that you can only do during certain times of the year. And then you're going to have to create these stakeholder groups. You can get them on parallel tracks while you're collecting data and get their first meetings going. But they're going to talk for a long time. Can't hurry that process because to get a robust discussion going, you have to develop a relationship of trust and knowledge among the players, and that's hard to do. That takes time. Look at the Watershed Council. We went 5 years before we got anywhere, simply because we spent the first 5 years basically just on our soapboxes. And I don't see flow setting being much different than that. So I think an optimistic viewpoint would be it would take 3 years from start to finish. I think that we might hit so many curves numbers and so forth, and arguments over is the data good, is the data bad, that kind of thing, that it might take longer than that. And if it was totally funded by the state and so forth, at least about 1.5 million, maybe more. 1.5 million, maybe more. Because the data collection itself is expensive. You don't send teams out into the field for nothing. And then you have all the overhead that you have to pay. And you know.
Would 1 year data collection be enough, given that flows really change so much from year to year?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question.
Given that flows change so much from year to year, would 1 year of data collection be maybe a series of...
Are there any hydrologists in the room?
Well, we have a lot of data just on the stream flows from 1992 going forward. We have at 6 different gauges in our basin every single day, flow levels. So the data is really for the wildlife.
It's
Versus the flows over time. It's what the fish do, what the...
hydrology is a wonderful science because it is based on statistics that are beyond my comprehension. They can take one data point and build a whole synthetic hydrograph off of it. And so, you know, Natalie was right that we do have a lot better gauging data than we did 50 years ago. So what would happen is they would set up the transects, measure the parameters on the transects and the EDT stuff, and then what they would do is extrapolate that statistically. Would it be enough? The people that didn't like the answer would argue no. The people that loved the answer would say, oh, we're done tomorrow.
But, I mean, in Spokane, they just did a rule, and they started in 2014. They finished early last year. It's in court now. But, you know, they came at least to a regulatorily issued rule in 4 years.
Yeah. And that's many times the outcome. Is that one side feels like they were left out of the process, and so they just say, okay, fine, we're going to have mom and dad decide. Another outcome, though, is a good one, like down in Chelan, where it took them 10 years, but a lot of that wasn't because they couldn't get along. Eventually, they decided the only way to fix it, and this is something we need to look at, is a legislative fix. Can we go to the legislature and have them fix it? But that in itself is a very lengthy process. When we went to the legislature as the Watershed Council about 6-7 years ago now, we were told by the legislators that water legislation is one of the most difficult and contentious and lengthy processes to ever get a law enacted that's affecting water. So back to your question, what's lengthy? It could be a really long time. Chelan took 10 years, and they didn't really do a formal IFIM. They just kind of worked, you know, their own process out, and it was very successful. But it took them a long time to do. We have to stick with it if we're going to make it work. But the root question is, that's the Chihuahua version if you haven't been up in my neck of the woods. But the root question is, you know, do we want to start? And if so, when? And it's a question that the Watershed Council is grappling with now because we don't have the resources to do everything we want to do. And so my recommendation at the last council meeting was let's stick with what we're doing on in-home metering and get something done before we launch into a huge project like this. But other forces from the outside may compel us to act differently. I don't know how that will be.
Like what? You just made mine.
Somebody may bring a lawsuit, or they will challenge the existing flow regime on a biological basis and say it no longer applies. It is not sufficiently protected, particularly of endangered species. We still got 3 of those. And that's the trump card. In all of the negotiations I was part of, the endangered species, the NOAA fisheries, basically listened very politely, but because they held, you know, all the royal flush in their hand, then they told us what they were going to do. And in the Methow, that's something to consider.
I mean, that's all well and good, but if they were that say, folks, why is it there's no fish passage on Chief Joe? Who made that call?
You know,
I mean, why is it that everybody decides that fish enhancement on the Methow is going to have anything to do with, you know, creating a better fish population?
I believe Noah Fisheries, and I have good evidence of this, that they believed that the Methow was a target of opportunity because they had a large population of people from the west side who were sympathetic to their cause, and they had what they considered to be egregious violations of the Endangered Species Act. You know,
And Chief Joe wasn't.
and they couldn't tackle that nut, so they took the one they could.
I think that's why everybody has such heartburn with it here, is, you know, do you really care about fish?
Yeah.
I mean, if you did, there's a lot of things you could be doing besides picking on the Methow Valley for enhancement.
We were an easy target.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened. And I am proud of the way that we came through. I think, you know, you know, Vic was here then, and it was pushing and shoving, but we actually came out of it with better irrigation systems for the irrigators that are not invisible to fish, but darn near. And we came out of it as a strong community. And I think, so in the end, if we can achieve that, if we can become a poster child for how to do it right from being the worst people on the planet in about 10 years, I think we can achieve something like this if we need to. At least that's my personal opinion. Anyone else? Well, there you go. Everybody's awake. I can't believe it. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention, for coming out. Remember, the next one's going to be Kent Woodruff Beaver. That's February 18th. February 18th.
Do you know where, Chris?
It will be here.
Back here.
It will be here, yep. And we would certainly appreciate the help from the Conservancy again.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then the one after that will be the drought management planning. That ought to be interesting.
Is Kent going to talk about beavers as storage?
He could. He could. I have my own opinions. I'm an opinionated guy. But yeah, he will.
Okay.
I won't be here, unfortunately, so I won't be able to. Well, no, hey, I'll put it out. Everybody's going to go home anyway. There has been a lot of statements about the storage benefit of beavers. I only know of one master thesis at the UW that actually tried to quantify that. And the results were what you might expect. There's a lot going on in a beaver dam and what lies underneath it and where the water goes. So they were ambiguous at best. So if I were a skeptic about this and say I was somebody that was trying to allow mitigation water for beaver storage, I would say you don't have the science to back up that claim yet. But it stands to reason, common sense, which is a very dangerous sort of sense, that beaver do store water, and that water goes somewhere, somewhen. But is it as beneficial as some people would like to think? Don't know. Don't have the data. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you. Drive carefully.
Thank you very much.